This podcast is not a substitute for professional medical advice or mental health care. Please seek help from a trusted counselor or call or text 988 if you are in crisis. Hey, everybody. Welcome to this bonus episode of I'll Start, and I'm Fred, part of the I'll Start team, and I also produce this podcast. And joining me today is Heather and Morgan, because over this past season, and honestly, through the whole podcast, many of our guests this year have shared moments of deep emotional pain, including things like suicidal thoughts. And we felt it was important to pause a minute and talk about this with both compassion and clarity, especially in the mindset of this is the holiday season, and that can be a really difficult time for some people.
Thanks, Fred. And hello, everyone. All around us, people are promoting joy and nostalgia and magic in preparation for Christmas and for New Year's. And the thing is, for so many people, behind the carols and the lights and the laughter lives this loneliness and sadness and hopelessness. And so this kind of experience is called cognitive dissonance, and the silence around it only creates more shame and isolation and confusion during this time.
Right. And so if you've ever had these thoughts or someone you love has struggled, first of all, we want you to know you are not strange. You are not broken, and you and your life absolutely matter. And that's why today we are naming what suicidal thoughts actually mean, what they don't mean, and we'll be sharing some biblical examples that show emotional despair has been a part of the human experience for ages. But before we go any further, we do want to pause and say this. Suicide is a difficult topic. And if you press play today, it could be because this topic touches your life in a very meaningful way.
Exactly. And so first, we just want to say thank you for listening. We don't take that lightly. And we want to say this clearly. Be kind to yourself while you listen. This conversation is heavy. It may stir things up. And so it's okay to pause and to take a break and to skip ahead or even to just come back later if you find yourself overwhelmed.
Exactly. And you're not doing this wrong if you need to step away right now. Listening at your own pace is not only wise, it's good self-care.
Welcome to All Start, where we share our story, listen with compassion, and connect through our faith and mental health experiences. Following this story, Morgan and I will offer insights that connect faith and mental health. We invite you to practice listening and understanding during this episode so that when someone shares their story with you in real time, you'll be ready. So take a deep breath, settle in, and let's start this journey together. So one thing that I wish people understood is that suicidal thoughts can be surprisingly common. There isn't a certain kind of person who has suicidal thoughts. It isn't that kind of issue. It's a human nervous system response to too much pressure, to too much pain, and too few perceived options. People feel cornered, like they don't have any option other than suicide. And so just to kind of show this, in 2023, suicide was a leading cause of death for individuals ages 10 to 64. That is shocking to me.
Gosh.
And often it's because someone feels trapped. They feel hopeless. They feel exhausted, overwhelmed. They're convinced that their situation will never change. And they may even believe that by ceasing to exist, that they'll be doing others a favor. And just to share a little bit of my own story, a few years ago, I found myself in a very similar place to this. And I will never forget something that my therapist said to me that just clicked. She said, oftentimes when we experience suicidal thoughts, we believe that we are the source of all of our problems. The common denominator causing everything to go wrong in our lives is us. But your life is not the thing that needs to end. These thoughts and feelings that we have, they're signals that something in your life needs care, needs attention, or needs to change. And that changed the way that I experienced those thoughts completely, because it's a belief that needs to change. It's a pattern that needs to change. It's a responsibility that I have that needs to change. Instead of the thing that needs to change is whether or not I exist.
Yeah. That is huge. And that is reflected throughout Scripture. God's people, prophets, leaders, the most faithful, they hit moments of despair that they didn't know how to handle. I think of Elijah saying, I've had enough, Lord, take my life. Moses said, I can't carry this burden alone. Please end it all. Jonah asked God to take his life in frustration and in exhaustion. David wrote Psalms that end in darkness. Job cursed the day he was born, and Jeremiah said, he wished he had never entered the world.
Yeah, and we're not diagnosing these people. We're just listening to their words, what they're lamenting. This deep emotional anguish, it's not unbiblical. It's actually part of being a human. So let's dive into some of these myths. Myth 1. Most people who talk about suicide are just being dramatic, manipulative, or looking for attention.
Wow, right out of the gate. There it is. Yeah, and that is a huge, really common one. Sadly, it is very common. And so first of all, let's just start here, is that when someone says that they want to die, they do require attention. Not punishment or not dismissal of how they're feeling, but care. And it actually does not matter whether someone's intent feels clear or confusing, whether they actually want to die or maybe they don't, it doesn't really matter because the response is the same. You believe them with your words and you believe them with your actions. Believe them. Someone using suicidal language to, get attention is still someone in distress who needs care, who needs boundaries, and who needs professional support.
Exactly. I'd absolutely rather overreact with care than underreact and then regret it later.
Absolutely. So what is the best way to respond?
So clinically, the best way to respond, we listen to three things: thoughts, intent, and means. And so thoughts are, are you talking about wanting to die or not existing? Or what would life be like? I want to go to sleep and not wake up, or I'm a burden on everybody else, or things would be better off for everybody if I didn't exist. Those kinds of thoughts, that's what you're looking for. Then the second is intent, is do they want to act on those thoughts right now? So you can have those thoughts and be thinking that through, but you don't really want to act on them in the moment. And so that's the second thing. And then the third thing that we're looking for clinically is, do they have access to a way to hurt themselves? So when they're talking about their intent, do they actually have access to the means to do that? Do they have access to something that could harm them? And so the thing is, though, you don't need perfect answers to these kinds of questions or these three things. You're just trying to understand how urgent the situation is so that you can respond appropriately.
And so what about self-harm? Because that's not quite the same as suicidal thinking.
Ooh, yeah. Wow. Okay, yeah. That is a really important question. And the short answer is not always. Not all self-harm means someone wants to die. Some people hurt themselves as a way to cope with overwhelming emotional pain.
That's heartbreaking, just to hurt yourself to cope with what you're feeling.
It really is. And it can also be really confusing from the outside. So I want to explain this carefully. We could honestly, I think we could do an entire episode on self-harm itself and not, suicide. But here's a brief clinical explanation. So our brains don't actually distinguish very well between emotional pain and physical pain. Pain is pain to our nervous system. So when the body experiences physical injury like self-harm, it releases these chemicals like endorphins and adrenaline, and that can temporarily reduce our pain and create a sense of relief. So when someone intentionally causes physical pain to themselves to cope with emotional pain, they're often just trying to access the body's natural pain relief system. So from the outside, that can be really confusing because it can look like suicidal behavior, but internally, it's often an attempt to survive really overwhelming emotions, and it's not actually an attempt to die. That said, self-harm is still serious, and it still needs professional support. And sometimes self-harm does include suicidal intent, which makes it more urgent.
So even if the intent isn't to die, it's still a signal that something is really wrong, something is going on.
Exactly. And this is the most important part. You do not have to figure out which one it is.
Right.
And I hope that that's a relief if you're listening. If someone is hurting themselves or talking about wanting to die or saying life feels unbearable, that alone is enough to reach out for help. You don't need a diagnosis. You don't need certainty. You don't need to wait until it's bad enough. Concern is enough. So we're going to include more detailed information and trusted resources in the show notes, just because we could do a full episode on self-harm. But I think that gives enough information about that particular issue, just for both education and support.
Absolutely. So going back to suicide, how do you discern when a situation is an emergency versus when someone might just need support?
That's another really important question. And honestly, it's one people are often afraid to ask about, I think. And here's the clearest guidance that I can give. You escalate immediately if any of the following are true. If they say that they want to die and they have a plan or access to the means to do so. If you suddenly lose contact with them and you can't reach them, they're not responding to texts, they're not responding to phone calls, you can't determine whether they're safe. If they're intoxicated, if they're disoriented, if they're highly impulsive, or it's very clear that they are not thinking clearly. And then honestly, if your gut tells you this feels really urgent, I think that internal alarm really matters. You don't need proof. You don't need certainty. If any of those are present, call 911 or your local emergency services. And I just want to say this clearly. That's not betrayal. That is care.
Yes, absolutely. That's an important distinction.
It really is. And, if the person is reachable and they're willing, another option is calling or texting 988 together if you're with them. And, you don't have to hand them a number and just walk away. You can sit with them while you do it. And a lot of times that's really helpful.
I think secrecy is something that really surrounds suicide. And, what about when someone begs you not to tell anyone? Because I feel like that happens a lot.
It really does. It especially happens with teens or with parents whose teens or kids are feeling suicidal. And so I think this is where people get stuck, right? So, you can say, I care about you too much to carry this secret alone. Getting help is a part of me caring for you and for me loving you. And so I just want to really clearly say, you're not breaking trust. You are building safety. Keeping a really dangerous secret doesn't protect someone. It isolates the both of you.
And honestly, I think regrets last a lot longer than anger.
Ooh, yes. Someone might be angry in the moment, but alive and angry is always better than silent and gone.
Yep. Man.
So here's what I want people to remember, you don't have to determine intent perfectly. You don't have to assess risk alone, and you don't have to keep dangerous secrets. When someone says they want to die, the safest response is to take it seriously and get help every time. And if you want to learn more about how to respond, what to say and where to turn, we've included additional resources in the show notes for education, support, and clarity.
Mm-hmm. All right. Another myth that we hear all the time is talking about suicide puts the idea in someone's head. And honestly, I think a lot of people stay silent because they're scared of making things worse.
That fear makes sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think people want to protect the ones that they love.
Mm-hmm.
But clinically, and I really want to be clear here, is that research consistently shows that the opposite is true.
Wow.
Talking openly about suicidal thoughts does not increase the risk. It actually reduces the risk because it reduces shame, it reduces secrecy and isolation. What increases danger when it comes to suicide is silence.
Right. So to ask someone who you're concerned about if they are thinking about suicide, that's not necessarily planting the idea in their mind.
No. If someone is already struggling, the idea is already there. You didn't plant the seed. And when we don't ask, what they often hear is, this is too much. I shouldn't talk about this. I shouldn't say this out loud. And so naming it out loud can actually bring relief. It tells someone, you're not alone, and I can handle this with you.
So I think people also worry, what if I say the wrong thing? And I get that, but from my perspective, saying nothing can feel a lot louder than saying something imperfectly.
And I think that's such an important point because you don't need perfect language. You don't need, a script of what to say. I think simple, direct questions like, are you thinking about hurting yourself? Are you thinking about wanting to die? Those questions, they don't increase risk. They increase connection.
That is so true. And that can be the turning point for someone seeking help. And that was my story. The moment that I began to seek help for the depression I was experiencing was when someone directly asked me if I had thought of killing myself. And it was a bold question, but it absolutely made all the difference. And from a faith perspective, silence, it can reinforce shame because it sends this message that, this topic is it's too dark for community. But Scripture shows us the opposite. God consistently meets people in their darkest thoughts, not after they've figured it out, not after they have cleaned themselves up.
Exactly. And clinically, when someone is able to talk about suicidal thoughts openly, their nervous system often settles. Those thoughts, they lose some of their power. And, I think that's because suicidal thoughts, they thrive in isolation. But in connection, they weaken.
So really, asking isn't dangerous. Avoiding the conversation is what's dangerous.
Yes. And if you're listening and you've been afraid to bring this up with someone you love, let this be permission. Talking about suicide does not cause suicide. What saves lives is noticing, asking, listening, and getting support.
Okay, this is the big one. Myth number 4, suicide is the unforgivable sin.
Gosh.
Let's all just take a breath there, right? Because you all know we've heard it.
Yes. And this myth has caused so much unnecessary fear and pain, especially in faith spaces. This idea that suicide is unforgivable is simply not biblical. This myth actually originated with the bubonic plague as a deterrent to suicide because in that time, just as many people were dying by suicide as they were the plague in order to avoid the plague. And it's just since evolved since then. But when Jesus talks about the unforgivable sin, he's speaking directly to religious leaders who were knowingly and deliberately rejecting the work of the Holy Spirit. He was not talking about confused people. He was not talking about hurting people. And he was not talking about people in trauma or despair or crisis.
Wow. I know so many people who needed to hear that. And from a clinical perspective, someone experiencing suicidal thoughts is not making, calm, clear, rational, or moral decisions. They are overwhelmed. Their brain is under extreme distress. They're often feeling narrowed and exhausted and flooded with pain. And this is not rebellion against God, it's suffering. Someone in a mental health crisis is not committing an unforgivable sin. They are experiencing unbearable pain. And God meets them and all of us with compassion, not condemnation.
Yes. And this part matters deeply, especially for anyone who has lost someone they love to suicide. Their story is not defined by that single moment. Only God knows the full picture of someone's life. Only God knows the full picture of someone's life. Only God knows the weight that they carried, the pain that they endured, the battles that they fought, and the love that they gave. And it is not our job to judge. We are not capable of seeing what God sees. And honestly, that is a gift to us. We are not God. We cannot see what he sees or know what he knows.
And thank God for that. Yes, thank God for that. Because this myth, it keeps people silent. It keeps families trapped in shame. And it keeps people from reaching out for help when they need it the most.
Yes.
And our pastor did a message specifically on this topic, and we can link to that in the show notes. So we've talked about what to do in a crisis, when to escalate, and how not to carry this alone. So let's zoom out for a minute and talk about what these thoughts are actually telling us.
That's so good. Clinically, suicidal thoughts tend to show up when someone feels overwhelmed or trapped, exhausted, or hopeless. And often there's this anger that is turned inward, a sense of being the problem. And what we call that is tunnel vision. When pain gets high, the brain narrows options. It stops asking, what could I do to change? And starts asking, how do I make this stop? And I think that is a huge difference in the thinking there. Moving from what can I change to I just need relief. How can I make this stop? And so those thoughts, those are not moral failures. They're not character flaws. They are signals that something has become too heavy for a person to carry alone.
That is fascinating. Understanding how the brain works is so important, and it matters in our treatment, right? In our care, because if we treat those thoughts like sin or weakness, that's when we go quiet. But if we treat them like signals of pain, we create space for healing.
And it's the difference between saying, what's wrong with you, and saying, something is hurting, let's pay attention.
That's a good clarification.
Okay.
Let me re-say that, sorry, because I said, what's wrong with you? What's wrong with you?
But that's how people say it. They say, what's wrong with you? Why are you thinking like this? What kind of person thinks these thoughts? And switching from thinking that, even to ourselves, being like, what's wrong with you? What's wrong with me?
Yes.
And saying, something's hurting. Let's pay attention to this.
Yeah. Be kind to ourselves.
Be kind to ourselves. Yeah, that's good.
All right. So how do we respond when someone trusts us enough to share a Okay, so how do we respond when someone trusts us enough to share that they are experiencing suicidal thoughts?
First, I think what to say matters more than having the perfect response, right? So knowing the kind of things to say. You can say, I'm really glad you told me. You can say, you are not a burden. I'm here with you. You don't have to carry this alone. I think those words reduce shame, and they open the door to connection and to support. But there are some things I think to avoid. And, I think saying things like, oh, you shouldn't think like that. Or, you just need to have more faith. You just need to pray harder. Or, hey, you know what? You have it really good. Other people have it worse. Or, stop being dramatic. Even though I think some of those things are well-meaning, like they're trying to snap people into having a different perspective, they can shut someone down. And they can cause people to feel dismissed or corrected.
And so if you're not sure what to say, this is enough. You say, I care about you and I want to help you stay safe. You don't have to fix it. You just have to stay present and take it seriously.
Yes, and presence doesn't mean secrecy. Care sometimes means inviting more support, not less.
Mm-hmm. And if you're listening and these thoughts feel familiar to you, I want you to hear this clearly. Your life is not the thing that needs to end, but something in your life may need care, attention, rest, or relief. It could be a belief, it could be a pattern, a responsibility, a way that you've been surviving that's costing you too much. You deserve help, you deserve support, and you deserve to live.
Yes. If you're in immediate distress, you can call or text 988 anytime. You do not need to know what to say, and you do not need to be at a breaking point.
Yes, that service is free, it's confidential, and you do not have to walk through this alone.
So, to kind of help us start to wrap things up, if this episode stirred something for you or reminded you of someone you love, please check the resources in our show notes. And they're there for education, for support, and for safety.
And thank you for sitting with us in a conversation that is not easy, but it is deeply important.
Your story matters. Your life matters. And we are walking with you.
We'll be taking a short holiday break, and we'll be back January 6th with another brave story and thoughtful discussion. Have a safe and Merry Christmas, and we'll see you next year on All Start.